here. So we're gonna go in the order of the program. So, you know, I don't want to waste any time. And let's hand over the floor to Marcelo from University of Toronto. I will stop sharing so Marcelo can share this side.
I can share my screen?
Yes, please.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, it's a real pleasure to be a part of ILERA. This is the first time I've done this conference, so let me go to full screen. Okay, and today I'd like to present on my new book called Worker Self-Management in Argentina, Contesting Neoliberalism by Occupying Companies, Creating Cooperatives, and Recuperating Autogestión. I'm going to be speaking about what are called empresas recuperadas por sus trabajadores in Spanish, but I'll be referring to them as ERTs, so worker recuperated enterprises. Okay, oops, let me just move forward. So like I said, this is findings. I'd just like to present highlights and findings from my new book, which came out as part of the Historical Materialism book series. The book is a lot of things. It's a microsociological political economy that strives to situate the group of Argentine workers that took over their workplaces and converted them to co-ops over the past 20 years. It roots them in historical materialist understanding and analysis. I then develop a social theory of autogestión, or worker self-management, which is the expression and the concept that the workers themselves use to describe their self-management projects. The book is also an oral labor history and a microsociological labor process-based account of the experiences of these workers from over 60 interviews and many ERTs that I visited since 2005, actually. And I just want to begin in our moment of crisis here by just situating it within crisis in general. And as we know, crisis is inherent to capitalism. Back in the 1960s, in another moment of tumult, social tumult, the German philosopher, critical theorist Herbert Marcuse wrote in his book, An Essay on Liberation, I'm paraphrasing, crises are moments of potentiality for another reality. More recently, talking about our COVID-19 moment, Naomi Klein said, crisis blows open the sense of what is possible. And in many ways, what I'll be talking about today is a particular moment of crisis in a particular national conjuncture, in a particular moment of crisis in neoliberal capitalism. I start my book with the words and experiences of Argentina's ERT workers. I spent most of my time in 4 ERTs. The first one is Cooperativa de Trabajo Chilever Artes Gráficas, or Chilever. This is a print shop. It's an emblematic ERT. It's very famous if you've studied the ERT movement. And it emerged from, at its apex in the 1980s, it was a private firm, private print shop of about 50 workers. By the crisis of the neoliberal model in Argentina at the turn of the millennium, there were 9 workers left. The 9 workers took over the firm and converted it to a worker cooperative and there was a lot of crisis and a lot of repression. The state kind of came heavy and the former owners wanted to recuperate their plant. It was declared bankrupt fraudulently, and the workers experienced about a year of not getting paid their salaries. They took it over, and now it's an active, thriving print shop that also has a recreation center, it's a community center, and also a K-12 high school equivalency or education and high school equivalency program that has emerged parallel to the ERT movement. The other place I spent a lot of time with was a construction firm and waste management firm in the suburb of Avellaneda. It's in the province of Buenos Aires. It was a 99 member co-op that formed into co-op in 2004. Interestingly, it was a recuperation from one of Argentina's largest multinationals, which is Techin. And it currently manages a massive 400-acre former waste dump that converted into an eco park. And it's involved in a lot of construction and public sector municipal maintenance in the southern Buenos Aires suburb of Avellaneda. The other ERT that I spent a lot of time with was Argentina's first worker recuperated newspaper in the city of Córdoba Comercio y Justicia. This was recuperated by about 60 workers. It's journalists and it's print shop workers, so blue collar and more white collar workers. And like I said, it was the first newspaper to be recuperated in Argentina. It's still a thriving newspaper. And it was the first, and now there are about 10 newspapers in Argentina that have been recovered by workers. I also spent a lot of time with another ERT in the city of Córdoba called Salud Junín. This is a clinic recuperated mostly by its female nurses. And it's a thriving, it was a private clinic, now it's a thriving worker cooperative clinic run by its nurses and maintenance staff. It contracts out services from local doctors. It's got about 60 specialists, and it developed a really unique insurance, health insurance program for workers in the city of Córdoba who aren't covered by Argentina's health services or are non-unionized. So what's called the la economía negra, or the black economy, derogatorily. So ERT started to emerge in the mid-1990s with the eventual collapse of the neoliberal model, and they still emerge. Now it's a way of creating a cooperative in Argentina and saving businesses. Interestingly, you find that they emerge, they're related to the GDP. That is, the GDP drops, ERTs emerge. The GDP goes down unless ERTs emerge, although they still do emerge. And there are about 400 of them as well. And like I said, they're still emerging. They're present throughout the Argentine urban-based economy. They're present in the four major sectors where they're present, which is steel workers, the steel sector, foodstuffs, printing and graphics, and textiles. It's not coincidental that these have amongst the most militant unions in Argentina. And although unions initially weren't supportive of ERTs because they didn't know where their place was, they eventually, many of Argentina's unions have become supportive of the movement. And now these workers, while they're self-managed, they still retain their union affiliation and pay union dues because in Argentina, unions also deliver social services and health services as well. And unions have now come on board after 25 years of this movement. And so they're also present throughout the Argentine territory. So like I said, the ERT movement emerges at a time where the neoliberal model collapsed. As many of us know, Argentina and Chile were the two test beds for the contemporary neoliberal model on a national scale. And they were bloody test beds. That is, the history of neoliberalism in Argentina and Chile have blood on their hands. Many disappeared, and its working class was decimated. Neoliberalism was taken on with force after the return of democracy, until a point which in the mid-1990s, the system began to collapse. Throughout the 1990s, because it had embraced so vehemently these neoliberal policies that include included the privatization of much of its public sector, the sell-off of most of its national assets, fixing the peso to the US dollar, so Argentina lost monetary sovereignty, deregulating to foreign investments, and really it was a takeover of international capital. International capital took over much of Argentina's economy, and small and medium-sized enterprises could not compete. And in the midst of this, owners of small and medium-sized enterprises didn't know how to react, or took it upon themselves to act corruptly and criminally, and in ways that they formed allegiance with corrupt court trustees, for example, and declared bankruptcy illegally. And some owners were just over their heads and didn't know what to do. So in the face of this moment, workers started to take over their firms rather than face permanent structural unemployment. The other context of the emergence of ERTs is the emergence of other social movements. So it emerges within a wide cross-section of social movements from across the Argentine national economy. With public sector, with a lot of publics, most of the first unemployed workers in the 1990s were public sector workers. Now these public sector workers, and there were hundreds of thousands of them that were unemployed, without having a business to strike, what they did was they formed collectives, and they became known as the piqueteros. And rather than taking, striking or walking out of their businesses or their public sector businesses, what they did was they took over the streets, blocked the streets. And so they cut off the veins of capitalism, right? The distributed veins of capitalism. The piquetero movements it was also an Occupy movement, take over the streets. The Empresas Recuperadas emerges at this time. Also, there was an emergence of popular neighborhood assemblies. So with the national government in crisis, with a vortex of governance, people took matters into their own hands, took the plazas, and made decisions that affected their neighborhoods and their own lives in popular, directly democratic assemblies. And then with the collapse of the Argentine peso, alternative currencies emerged, and barter clubs as well. So this was around the turn of the millennium, and this is the context that Argentina's ERTs emerged. In December 2001, when Argentina declares when it basically declares bankruptcy on its national economy, it was the first. It was the largest national collapse at the time. The people took to the streets, and the slogan was "Que se vayan todos," everyone in the political and economic establishment leave. And this was like the rallying cry, the clarion call, which was a two-folded clarion call. One, it was a clarion call of rebellion, right? Rebelling against a corrupt system and with people that had had enough. On the other hand, it was a call to create a new form of economy from below. And many of these expressions that I just covered emerged during this time as well. So Que se vayan todos was an important movement. The ERT workers at the time, this is when you start seeing a peak of new ERTs, and the slogan they took on was "Occupy, Resist, Produce," and this also nicely covers the three stages to taking over a workplace and converting it to a cooperative in Argentina. And they borrowed this from Brazil's landless workers and peasants movement. So ocupar, resistir, producir, and it's still very much the slogan for many ERTs in Argentina. So there are three major concepts that run through my book, and these are concepts that the very workers use. So they became a central part of my book. And one is autogestión. This is the most important concept. Autogestión is, in essence, the translation as worker self-manage or self-management, but it's inadequate. The English translation, to me, is inadequate. And the French-Spanish version is much more powerful, and takes into account the agency that workers have. Autogestión comes from the Greek word auto, or self-same, and the Latin gestio, or to manage, or to gestate. Like I said, in English, it's inadequately known as self-management. And I'm trying to kind of popularize this term in the English-speaking world. So we'll see how much it gets taken up. Again, it's this two-folded, two-faced dialectical expression within it. One of rebellion, or one of resistance against the corrupt neoliberal system and severe exploitation by bosses and business owners and capital, but also one that guides the prefigurative and creativity of another type of socioeconomic reality. So it's a concept that emerges from the very experiences of these workers and further nurtures a two-folded practice of rebellion, but also recreation and reinvention. So it was a concept that itself was recuperated. So not only were workplaces recuperated by ERT workers, but language was recuperated. I recently wrote an article called, the recuperation of the language of autogestión. And this is very much, they recuperate the language that they can then express these movements. One of the workers, actually, that I interviewed gave me the best definition of autogestión from the newspaper Comercio Justicia. The possibility that we, all people, have to realize ourselves professionally, economically, and in our capacities to labor. It emerges from within ourselves and together with the people with whom we want to share this realization, but without sacrificing personal freedom, without sacrificing personal dignity, and from our own developmental potential. It is, in other words, about the possibility of the full development of the human being. Recuperation is the second major concept that threads throughout my book. And I use recuperation specifically and not recovery or conversion, although I do use conversion in another project that I'm working on. Because recuperation, again, is a much more powerful and grounded concept. It's got this twofolded nature to it. It's like as if it's one's recuperating from an illness, from the illness of capitalism and exploitation. So it's about the recuperations of workers living labor for themselves rather than for masters or bosses. The return of control over workers' creativity and productive capacities as human beings by workers themselves. In my book, I talk about ERT's 7 recuperative moments. There are 7 things that ERT workers recuperate besides a firm or besides private property or besides a plant. They recuperate in this I take from a straight up reading of, a kind of rereading of Capital, Marx's Capital. I turn it on its head. And what was Marx kind of talking about if you invert capital? Yes, it's a critique of capitalism, but if you invert it, it's actually a manual for workers' liberation, right? And this is what the ERT movement is promising or prefigures. The creative skills and capacities inherent to workers' labor power is recuperated. That is, labor power gets decommodified and gets taken back by workers. The surpluses that are created from workers' own efforts are taken back. Workers' associated labor and voluntary cooperation. Marx spends an entire chapter on cooperation, but this is cooperation seized by capitalism for workers to work under the same roof. Well, workers are now seizing this cooperative capacity back, which is really a human capacity to cooperate, right? The labor process in general, the divisions of labor, the social production of social wealth, and ultimately workers' dignity. And the third major concept is cooperation. Workers transform these formerly capitalist workplaces into worker co-ops, from private firms to worker co-ops. They learn this on the path of doing, or sobre la marcha. They take on a concept they call compañerismo, or camaraderie, and it helps them transition from managed workers to self-managed, managed employees to self-managed workers. Ultimately, their subjectivities are transformed. And Cándido González, one of the founders of Chile Ver, put it this way: this transition that happens over the struggle. Looking back on your struggle 3 years on, I can see where the change in me started. It begins during your struggles. First, you fight for not being left out on the street with nothing, and then suddenly you see that you formed a cooperative and you start getting involved in the struggle of other ERTs. You don't realize it at the time, but within your own self, there's a change that's taking place, and you realize it afterwards. You start doing things that you would never imagine yourself doing. Remember, these were blue-collar workers, right? That didn't have, I saw the hand, that didn't have an idea of forming a cooperative. It was a defensive move that then gets converted into an offensive move, and it struggles against the very worst effects of capitalism. They overcome their challenges cooperatively as well. Like, they have to learn how to be cooperators, restart production. How do you finance and capitalize? We can get into some of that during the discussion. Argentina's inappropriate bankruptcy laws or lack of inadequate state supports compelled them to unify in para-union organizations, umbrella organizations that represented the interests of workers. And they managed to reform. So 400 ERTs, 16,000 workers managed to reform Argentina's business laws, bankruptcy laws, the use of expropriation. So they convinced the state to expropriate these firms on behalf of workers and transform them to cooperatives. And then workers have 20 years to pay these expropriations back. So really innovative use of expropriation law and cooperative laws. And now with this new kind of more sympathetic government of Alberto Fernandez, you see some of these leaders of the ERT movement actually being represented in ministries and departments within the new Argentine government. And there's a new law of recuperation and of productive entities being proposed as well. And finally, and I have, I'll just quickly go through these slides. I'll show you the pictures. I won't be able to get into specifics. But I also in my book talk about radical social innovations of ERTs. That is, they're radical because they contest neoliberalism and capitalism, and they're novel solutions to social problems. That these technologies of the firm are transitioned into novel, radical social innovations to help local communities. So one radical social innovation is engaging in social and solidarity economic practices as collective responses to continuous crises and threats. New ways of producing, new ways of forming marketing collectives and productive collectives, production between firms. They become much more socially just workplaces and economically fairer and more democratic. 71% of them, about 70% of them practice direct across the line, equitable pay schemes, salary schemes. They bring the community into the workplace. A formally private workplace gets opened up to the community, and the spaces that aren't used for production are used for community cultural centers, democratic and popular education initiatives, free health clinics in depleted neighborhoods, and also dedicating portions of their revenues to community economic development. So 25%, 10% of the revenue goes directly into the community, surrounding communities, to help their own workers and other community members in, for example, dignified housing and building children's sports complexes. And they call this, and I'm almost done, they call this La Fábrica Abierta, or the open factory, which is another kind of concept that we learned from the ERT movement. And they're found in other parts of the world, by the way, not just Argentina, but Argentina is kind of like the leader, like the inspirational leader. Most of them are found there. But you also find these types of firms in Uruguay, Brazil, Southern Europe, France, Spain, Italy, really where neoliberalism has exerted its force with a vengeance over the past few years. Many of them, there's a lot of transnational learning that goes on as well. And I think I'll just stop there. I just wanted to leave you with this slide, that these also exist in Canada as well. They're not as dramatic as Argentina. They're called buyouts in Canada, or conversions to cooperatives. But these are also troubled firms. For example, in Quebec, the ambulance sector, much of it is a cooperative, are worker co-ops. So it's possible in the global north as well, and also as a response to our current COVID-19 crisis, this could be a solution to saving businesses as well. And we can discuss this during the discussion period. I think I went a little over my 2 minutes, but I do thank you. And yes,
Thank
there you go.
Yeah, thank you, Marcelo. Fascinating discussion. And I have some question myself, but I will hold it to the Q&A sections.
Sounds good.
Yes, and I will also encourage, if you want to speak and ask your question directly, please hold it to the Q&A session towards the end. But if you have some burning questions, feel free to type in the chat. So give the presenter some time to process and digest your question as well. And feel free to type your comments in the chat as well. And do we have Rabih Jamil here? Okay, so if that's the case, our next presenter will be Professor Jen Holgate, and she's going to talk about the non-workers as the new actors to build the union. So Jen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tingting. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be talking to you today about some research that I've been doing with one of the largest unions here in the UK. So I ended up at the end of my slides rather than the beginning. So I'm going to be talking, can I just ask whether you can hear me okay? Yeah, great, okay. There's some children crying in the street. I'm sorry if you can hear that as well. But I want to talk today about non-workers as the new actors rebuilding unions. What we've been trying to do is to understand why people who are not in paid employment decide to join trade unions. If the main reason workers tend to become union members is primary instrumental, i.e. they've got a problem at work that they need assistance for, what are the factors then that are driving people to join unions when they're not in work themselves? What are the motivating factors when there's no obvious material benefit for them? So the questions are, why do people who are not in paid employment decide to join a trade union? How does studying Unite Community, this is a section of the largest private sector trade union in the UK, how does studying Unite Community assist us in understanding trade unionism in a changing world? So let's go right into it then. What are the motivating factors for non-workers joining trade unions? The findings from lots of other studies from the literature say that they can be categorized in three main areas: instrumental, ideological, cultural, and social customs. So if we take the first one, instrumentalism, it's thought about or identified as one of the primary reasons for joining trade unions, the main reason. It always comes out in research as one of their highest response rates to surveys. If you've got a problem at work, that's the reason for joining, and improved paying conditions. So, you know, you could say, well, that's not surprising then, given that's, you know, that is the main reason. It's the raison d'etre of trade unionism as defined by the Webbs way back, where they talked about it being a continuing association of wage earners for the purpose of maintaining and improving the conditions of employment. So in that sense, joining a trade union is a rational choice based upon the likelihood of, you know, getting material benefits such as union representation, higher wages, better terms and conditions, etc. The second one is ideological. It's another reason put forward, where there's a political commitment, say, for example, for the values of collectivism. And one explanation might lie in the general value system of an individual, for example, which can be traced sometimes to society in general or to family, where there's been a history of trade unionism. We know that if your mother or father or grandparents have been members of trade unions, that's a sort of a predictor of union joining. And there's a positive correlation between left-wing ideology and union membership. So we might expect to find that workers who've got an ideological predisposition to trade unions and will join regardless whether there's any material benefit or not. Okay, the third one then, other writers have said it's important to consider social, cultural or social or psychological approaches to understanding trade unionism and joining. Social customs help to determine the likelihood of joining when it's bound up with group culture in some way, whether, like I said, whether there's a history of trade union involvement in your family or in a particular sector or a particular type of job associated with high union density. And we know that colleagues play a significant role in that as well, friends and colleagues, and sort of culturalising people into trade unions. And Andy Charlwood is a colleague of mine. His analysis has shown that where someone lives is also an important influence on their willingness to join a trade union. Again, very much related to history and culture. We see that in traditional industries where, you know, there's high union density, you know, again, there's a social and cultural custom to join a trade union. So, okay, so that's the sort of background then in terms of motivating factors. But then, you know, what are the motivating factors when you're not in employment then? I suppose for us, when we started this research, we thought, well, actually, it's probably ideological because the other things don't fit in quite the same way. Of course, in terms of social and cultural, they do, but there must be some sort of ideological reason for people to go out of their way to join a trade union. So we might expect that instrumental reasons weren't the main impetus because they've not been in employment. And so we decided we'd talk to people and ask questions as to what was the motivating factor for joining. So what did we do then? We did a whole series of interviews with members, semi-biographical interviews, so we could tap into that sort of, you know, people's backgrounds, their history, their social, their socialization, culture, etc., to see, you know, what sort of stories were being told. You know, we could figure out then whether ideological reasons. We also did interviews with staff within the union, particularly those who are involved in the Unite community section of the union. And I'll come on and explain a little bit about that in a while. And we looked at 3 different regions of the UK as well. The union itself is split into quite large regions. And we just sort of wondered whether there was a difference between the regions, because we know there's higher union densities in certain parts of the UK, lowest union density in London and the Eastern region. Okay, so I'll come back to that later. So just a little bit then about what Unite community membership is. So as I said, Unite is the largest private sector trade union in the UK with about 1.3 million members. And about 8 years ago, they set up a separate section within the union, which they called Unite Community. And it was a response to the challenges faced by, you know, falling membership, the change in labour market, much more precarious work, but also this sense that unions have become disconnected from the wider public as well. And so in order then to look into a little bit more about what Unite was saying the purpose of community was and comparing that to what people who were joining it thought it was, we thought that'd be an interesting thing to look at. So in terms of Unite, it said its mission is to organise people to strive for a society that places equality, dignity and respect above all else. Unite's community membership scheme brings together people from across our society, those not in employment or welcomed into the union family, adding another dimension to our strength in thousands of workplaces across the UK and Ireland. So that's all very fine and dandy, but it doesn't really tell us much about the activity and how members can get involved, or how branches function, or how did members articulate their understanding of what they were joining and the purpose of Unite Community. So we thought we'd go and ask them. So this was just some sort of responses when we were doing the interviews. Overall, I think most people were able to describe to us as Unite Community being providing a space for people not in employment to be part of the union movement. But you could say, well, okay, that's a fairly vague description then. But when we tried to push them, say, well, come on, tell us a little bit more about what it actually, what you think it means and it does. Lots of people struggled to actually articulate or put into words exactly what it was. So one of the things we often did was say to people, okay, so you've joined Unite Community. Say you were talking to a friend or somebody on the street. What would you say Unite Community is? And then they sort of got a little bit flummoxed. They found it really difficult. They sort of knew it in their heart, but they couldn't actually articulate it. Which in a sense is not surprising, because you ask anybody, why would you join a trade union if you're not actually in work? It didn't really sort of make sense. But most were comfortable in describing the initiative as a community-based union for the unemployed or the underemployed to engage in social justice campaigns. And I think that was the most articulate that we came across. But it was also described by some as revisiting the mutual aid tradition of 19th century trade unionism. But then we said, okay, so you've talked about what you think it is, but what do you think it should be? And again, we thought we might get some different responses to this. And here are just some examples. And while these, I think, fit with the vision from the originators of the initiative, i.e. it provides a campaigning voice for the unemployed, many also said to us, we think it should also be for the underemployed as well. So this was quite interesting. It's for those people who they thought weren't in traditional workplaces, and particularly people talked about the gig economy and people being forced into self-employment or precarious jobs, or people who were carers and couldn't actually work because they were spending all their time caring. But it was interesting looking at the union's rule book, because Unite is very explicit that people who are working and are employed should join the industrial side of the union. They shouldn't be part of the community side of the union. The political nature of Unite Community was evident in virtually all the interviews that we did. It was very much about understanding, organising the unorganised, getting people involved in community politics through non-partisan organisation, and others described it as providing a home. I think this was quite an interesting point for those on the political left, aligned or otherwise, to undertaking campaigning work. This was really quite interesting because people talked about their own political backgrounds, and they were from all sorts of different political parties, not the Labour Party, some far left parties, the Green Party, etc. But they liked the idea of not operating in silos within these political parties. They liked this idea of actually being stronger together as a community in a local area by combining with like-minded people. Maybe we can come back to talk about that later. This is just a quote from one of the interviewees. He said, "I think that Unite Community is integral to the industrial and political strategy of Unite. It crosses sectoral boundaries. It's open to people who are not eligible to be previously eligible to be members because they didn't have an industry or a workplace, because they're retired students, unemployed, etc." And then he goes on. So I think Dave, as we've named him here, makes reference to the purpose of Unite Community, providing support to the industrial side of the union. And this was really well understood by all interviewees. They saw themselves almost as a sort of set of shock troops that could go in and support industrial campaigns. You know, there was a sense that in some workplaces, when industrial action was taking place, there wasn't the confidence of members to be visible, whereas people who were from the community had nothing to lose. They weren't going to be sacked, they weren't going to be victimised, but they could turn up on picket lines and do all sorts of protests that perhaps weren't open to people who are actually in the workplace. So that was an interesting aspect to this. Who were these people? They were mainly retirees, which, you know, in a sense makes a lot of sense. These are people who've got lots of time on their hands. They've been trade union activists, long histories of, you know, left-wing politics and membership involvement of trade unions, and they were strong advocates for social justice. So these were people who, you know, had lots of history behind them, retired, maybe retired early, but wanted to still be involved in politics, but not necessarily through a political party, and this gave them that particular opportunity. A quote from one of the interviewees: there was a selfish motive as well, which was, I thought was brilliant. We can tap into Unite's incredible resources. So there's lots of self-interest here. You know, we can get money for leafleting and campaigns, advertising campaigns that they're involved in their local community. Again, for another one, this is from someone who was actually working and self-employed, so in theory shouldn't have been a Unite community member, but you know, there's sort of different attitudes in different regions as to, you know, allowing people in under the radar. If you don't ask too many questions and you don't know their employment, then maybe they can still be involved. Because of the campaigning that I'm doing, I felt more comfortable, you know, sorry, I can't read the side of my quote now. Because of the campaigning I'm doing, I felt like the campaigning was actually my central occupation, and the other stuff is what I have to do to put the bread on the table. So really, I want to be in a union that reflects what I do, rather than where I get my income from. That's ultimately why I'm involved in Unite Community. Okay, though, so unpacking these stories of motivation then in more detail, we find that the social norms and individual values have a profound influence on the willingness of people who are not in employment to join trade unions. The members that we interviewed would most likely have started their working lives in the late 60s and 70s at a time when union density was high, when half of all employees were in trade unions. Collective bargaining was normal. It was covering 70 to 80% of workers, and unions had considerably more power. And as a result, I think the normative influences at workplace level would have meant that many workers came to see trade union membership as a social custom. It was you know, in a sense, part of an obligation to conform or not to be seen as a free rider. So it was something that they'd sort of learned. It was their history and tradition. So I suppose then, what does this mean then for this particular union in terms of member activism? What does it mean in terms of power and influence as an organising approach? And what does it tell us about union purpose? I think it would appear from the interviews that a key motivating factor for these members was precisely the opportunity to be part of a union, to have a voice heard, but in a social justice sense in a local community. There was a deep ideological commitment to unionism, but it was also very political as well. There were lots of opportunities we found for social justice campaigning where people lived, but they really liked the idea of doing this under a sort of bigger umbrella that was part of a wider social movement and from a trade union. So that was important. It was interesting, most of these people had not been members of this particular union before. They'd been members of all sorts of other different unions. So some of them were members of their retired sections of their particular union, but that didn't give them the opportunity to organise with people in their locality in a much wider sense. So it provided what they said, a political home. And this is quite a nice quote. We pride ourselves on being non-sectarian. We've got a socialist party, we've got socialist work, we've got the Green, we've got the Communist Party, Morning Star readers, some Labour Party members. We're a real mix and we work together really well. And this came across as quite surprising because you probably know if you've been involved in any political groups, the level of sectarianism between these types of groups. But it was interesting, people did work extremely well together on a locality, and I think there's probably a lot that we could learn from that. Okay, I'm probably running out of time. So I suppose our question at the end then is this a way of redefining the purpose of trade unionism? We know that many union members are more engaged in their communities than they are in their own unions. So it's a real potential to broaden the base of trade unionism should unions decide that they're going to organise in this particular way. Real opportunities to grow the union movement and to tie it in to where we are currently. I'm sure where you are in all different parts of the world, that mutual aid groups have set up everywhere in order to support people through the COVID crisis, you know, people helping each other, getting their prescriptions, getting food for people, just checking on neighbours, etc. And I think this form of trade unionism, about moving out into the community, but being part of this big umbrella of something, you know, much wider and stronger, is a real potential for, you know, broadening the base of trade union and getting trade union much wider understood against a layer of the population that doesn't really know what trade union is. So I'll leave it there, and yes, I'll take some questions later. So thank you.
Thank you, Jen. And Jamil? Yes, I'm going to share my presentation. Okay, so thank you for this opportunity to present. This is a kind of like a working in progress, but I would say this is kind of like a joint work with myself and Lorenzo Frangi from UQAM in Canada. I did my PhD at University of Toronto, and now I'm currently working in the US. And this is a kind of like a bigger, I would say the second part of a sequel project that we are working on, really try to understand the 5415 movement and how they communicate in this broader kind of social justice movement. And I want to start like to talk about the motivation why we kind of like, really dive into this line of research. When I was in the PhD program, because we're industrial relations program, like I really got into this idea about union and unionization. And it's depressing that, especially in private sector, union density has been decreased both in the US and in Canada, and especially in the US. And in the past couple of years, even unionization in the public sector was bluntly attacked by, the policymakers in the US with the pass of Janus in 2018. So this long line and extensive research about, union declining and the union revival, and what kind of ways that we can, really reinvent or re-energize the labor movement back to the heydays that Zhang talked about in the 50s and 60s when, 50% of the workers were union members. So like this really kind of started motivation, right? Looking to different kind of like research. And there's a research about international collaboration and a coalition between, unions and the social movement and all kinds of things. Like, but so far, like we see success in different cases and different areas, but how do we make sure like, we can find something that really tangible for labor organizers, for trade unions to really kind of say, yes, this is applicable for us. So this is kind of like really the beginning part of our research project. And then because, my interest in the information communication technology, we started kind of really looking specifically in terms of how ICT can help unions to re-energize and revitalize themselves by both internally and externally. Internally, they kind of like provide a source of internal exchange and improve the democratic participation. And then the external side, how do we disseminate their messages and engage with new broader social audience? So that's kind of like, the background. And with particular interest in how social media played a significant role in this process. Okay, so we kind of focus in this particular, I would say, broader case as 5415 and the minimum wage campaign, especially in the US. I really like this post, so I put it like in the slides. And there may be times when community unions step on the toes of organized labor. I think there's a different kind of like a view in terms of how and why 5415 has been so successful in the past several years. Like they really pushed the legislation kind of changes, like the policies, has been implemented. Minimum $15 minimum wage has been like operationalized in multiple cities and multiple states in the US, and across the globe, everyone kind of like recognized the $15 minimum wage is something that's like, it becoming both symbolic and kind of like a solid demonstration about the societal recognition of the labor and the social movement. So this is kind of really triggered us to try to get a sense about what is going on, why this campaign has been like, really successful. And of course, like this also coupled with a couple kind of like a successful story and wide recognition in policy and communication field that social media has been kind of like a, instrumental to help disseminate like a wider range of topics that really brought the discussion among multiple kind of like participants in our society. So this kind of really gets back to our initial kind of question is, how do we understand this? Like, what does this mean to labor union and both labor union and the social movement as well? And now we want to kind of focus in really the social media, and there's a couple kind of like a discussion in terms of the nature of the 515, and that is really a social movement, or this is like, a mob unionization. Recently, there are a couple of papers that really start looking into these issues from different angles. But what we try to focus in our previous publication and this project is try to understand what's the communication strategy and how does this impact when, the unfolding of the social discussion, and then what's the role of those like social kind of like movement groups, the civic society groups and the unions play. In our kind of like I think about the most kind of like, the central question about the social media support is really kind of come to the two main mechanism. One is they have to have a strong supporting network, and the other is really basically what we call the user reputation part. So you have to be recognized as legit content creators on the social media, so people are willing to follow you. And over time, you have to distribute like, tangible or valuable information to the rest of the network, so people will continue to follow you, because, it's pretty much on social media is open to all communication. There's no way that you can control how information being disseminated across the network, because, people follow you. If they like what you said, they kind of like, can retweet or like your information, that pass the information to their followers. But if they don't really like your ideology or the information you provided, they can just, unfollow you and cut the information and network. So it's really kind of a tricky business in terms of how you manage your social media presence and the communication that you have. So that's what we want to study here. So in this particular project, we try to understand the following research questions. And the trade unions among the most active accounts in the Twitter debate about the 515 campaign, right? Like there's a kind of like a different discussion in terms of like how important or how influential that union are in this movement. So we want to understand using empirical evidence, and are unions able to gain central positions among most active accounts in this campaign network? And to what extent they can expand the discussion and really kind of like a passing along the information and then bring more people into the discussion and bring broader awareness in terms of the social movement, and how do this aspect change around and across the main campaign event. So the methodology and data we used, and we followed the discussion between June 2015 and June 2016. So 12 months of social media discussion. If you use the 515, if you follow 515, if you retweet information related to 515, we capture your discussion, and of course, like in English. So using this live capture and live stream, we collected about 667,000 tweets over this 12 months span, and also the corresponding accounts and their information, including when they registered on Twitter and when they retweeted the information related to 515 and the geographic language and their biographic information as well. We identified 7 events across the 12 months that we think that have some meaningful kind of like a relationship with the movement. And during each event period, we identify who's tweeting and discussing about 515 before and who's discussed that after. And during those discussions, we identify in each time point the 20 most active accounts. So the people who's tweeting and retweeting the most during this 48 hours window before and after the account event. And because this particular project, we focus on the kind of like the supporting network and the network structure. So the methodology we use is the social network analysis. And we follow the Hamilton, I'm sorry, I'm terrible with pronunciation, et al. Approach. They develop a typology using different network measures to identify what kind of a structure that the network represented. But we analyze both at the node level, which is the individual accounts, and at the network level. So to start, give you kind of like a general idea about what is going on. So like I said, we pick up 7 events, and before after we have a 14 different time periods. So during this 14 different time period, we track the top 20 most active accounts. So those are the people that, like I said, they tweet and retweeted the most, during the discussion among like all the people talk about the 515. So we identify them as the core content creators. And we categorize those accounts based on their individual bios and the information they tweeted. So here you see the colored different groups. The red groups are the 515 groups. Okay, so 515 Chicago, 515 Florida. So those are the kind of like, 515 group. The blue ones at the bottom, you can see those are the union accounts. So those could be the union nationals, they could be the union locals, as long as they represent a group of workers and they self-claim their unions. We consider they are the labor unions. And the apart color, those are what we call the civic society groups. And green ones are the individual accounts. We have a little bit purple over here. Those are the political accounts. Most likely those are the campaign accounts. And the yellow ones are sometimes the media and the professional service groups. So if you look at the kind of a trend over time, the persistent kind of like, display that the account that present both before and after across those 7 events are mostly the 515 group. Okay, so here you can see that there are 4 515 groups accounts that they present both in the 7 events, and then another 2 appeared during the 2 events, and then there's another one that appeared in the 5 events. And on this side, you can see that there's a 1-timer or 2-timers. Most of them are individual account, and we see just one union account that appeared in 2 events. So this gives us like a pretty good sense about there's a distinctive behavior between the 515 groups and the union groups. So the unions, they appear less, and they are not consistent in terms of the timeline. And this really demonstrates the network kind of like a plot between 2 different times that we capture. So we captured the one period that's before July 27, 2015, like that's the kind of beginning of our kind of time capture in our research. And then we also captured toward the end of our data point, which is June 07. Sorry, that's a typo, that's 2016. I have to change that. So for folks who's not familiar with social network analysis, that this plot the relationship among all the kind of like what we call the core content creators that we captured in our data. Okay, so like I said, the top 20s in each time, and we capture all 14 different data sets. So in total, we find that it's amazingly that the top content creators have been quite consistent. So, with 280 data points, we was able to capture 137 unique data points. So 137 unique content creators in this broader kind of social discussion in 12 months period. And you can see the red ones are the 515 group. I labeled the account names. You can see the 515 515 LA, Chicago, and fast forward, that's another one that's close to Atlanta. And the blue ones, the similar things as the previous slides, those are the union groups. And if you look at the aquatic ones, those are the civic society. And of course, like the green ones are individual. So compare the beginning of the kind of like the movement toward the end of our data capture period, we can see this kind of like a whole content creator network has become more dense, which means that like those people follow each other more over time. And also we see that the 515 group, they are at the center of the network. So more people are following them over time as well. And then somehow like the labor union account get pushed a little bit further away from the center. And of course, they still hold a critical position as the size of the nodes shows that's the betweenness connectivities that we measured in the network. So I'm not going to bore you with all those methods, but like, when I say betweenness, that means that those people are information brokers in this network. So if I want to pass along some information, if I'm a part of the network, then my message needs to go through those bigger nodes in order to pass to another people in this network. Okay, so this is a core kind of content creators network. We also plotted the network among all those followers. So like if your account has like 40,000 followers, of course we capture all their information and we plot them. Again, I'm sorry about the typo. So before July 22nd, 2015, that's the date between like July 20 to 21st, 2015, we captured the network. And you see the red area, those are the accounts that follow the 515 groups. Okay, the green ones, those follow the individuals. Of course, the blue ones, those are follow the union account, our top 20 active account. And at the beginning of our data capture period, we identified 72,200 unique followers for this network. And toward the end, we identified 181,370 accounts as well. So compare the size of the network has grown substantially over time, which means that the movement is really kind of bringing more people's attention, and they have more people that actively talking about this. Remember, those are the followers will get the direct message from the top 20 active accounts. Okay, so in each of those accounts, they're gonna have followers, even though we didn't really capture the number of followers. So, but like, we can see, safe to see that 10 times or 20 times more people will get the message, because this is just the first degree connections, and those accounts will actively kind of tweet and repeat the information, so information can further disseminated through their network as well. And an interesting part about this kind of a network plot is that we saw that unions start bringing more kind of like, followers. If you see the beginning kind of plot, and they are part of like overlapping networks with other 515 groups, but like in terms of people who's actually directly following those networks, they are much smaller compared to the beginning toward the end. But the kind of like a downside about this part is that we see fewer unions actually still engaged in and be super active as a content creators in this network. So that's kind of like the struggle that we are working on and try to unfold. So to conclude, there's a clear distinction, like I said, between the 515 and the union groups using various network measures. Like we measure, like we said, we measure at the individual level and we measure at the network level. Those shows that those two groups behave really differently. And this is kind of like follow what we find in our previous paper they have a very different communication strategy. We did interviews both between the union organizers and 515 communicators. They both acknowledge there's a kind of a clear communication strategy difference between these two groups when they communicate online about their ideas and also about the 515. But we still argue there's ample opportunities to play a significant role in terms of unifying the network and delivering controlled message to a broader community, share their ideology, and even building solidarities. And some people like really argues that, you know, online social media communication is just clickism, right? Like, you know, how we kind of move the clickism to the activism. That's a really tricky question. What we try to argue is that you have to get step one to move to the step two, right? Like, you know, the old way is clearly not working. Like, we don't have, as a labor unions, you don't have the capacity to still doing your on-ground outreach, to knock on the doors, to bring people in, right? And adapt yourself and change your strategy to reach to like a different audience, to really bring, I really kind of like it, this whole session, the theme, and with Marcelo and James' discussion about social justice, because social justice appeals broader audience compared to, you know, the butter and the bread kind of labor issues. So you have to kind of immerse yourself as a unions to bring yourself into the broader kind of discussion to make yourself more relevant. And this also kind of like, you know, bring our last point that I'm gonna wrap up my discussion. And even though unions are very hesitant in terms of how they interact on social media, they still are viewed as a valuable member of the core groups, because the historical and the institutional influence and the reputation they have on the ground. This kind of really reflects to Jen's kind of research, why those retired workers still want to be part of the union, because of the legacy, because of the institutional knowledge, because they are still organized and they have those vast kind of like, I would say, membership and supporters in the society. They are seen as a legit institutional partners in all those social justice discussions. That's why, you know, you gotta leverage this, because, you know, as time goes on, you're gonna become, if you don't, labor unions, if you don't, guys don't change, you guys gonna become less relevant over time, right? Like, you're gonna kind of fall off the wagon. So make something. I want to kind of wrap up my presentation using one of the discussion we had yesterday in a different session when we talk about the police unions currently in the US. And then I think Professor Harry Cass from Cornell, like, he made a really good point. He's like, unions need to make sure they are still part of the solution, to make them to be able to effectively to continue organize and contribute to the positive factors in our society. So I'm gonna stop there. Thank you. Okay, so in this kind of like a concluded our presentations with all the presenters, and this is a Q&A session, and I would like to invite questions, comments. You can either type your questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand. Like, we have a kind of cozy enough group, so if you want to just comment or ask questions, you can just turn on your, you can just unmute yourself and ask your question. Yeah, I echo Jane. She really, she said it would be nice to see who's in the room if you want to turn on your video. Hey, Lorenzo. Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna shamelessly abuse my role as a chair to ask the first round of questions. The first question is from Marcel. Like, I really like your book about this whole co-op discussion. I heard about co-op in Canada as well, but like, I didn't know that, you know, co-op in Argentina has been so successful. I'm particularly interested in the part that you mentioned, the nurses co-op. And I think it's fascinating. They can, you know, build an organization and like a hire physicians. That to me is totally kind of like a, you know, flip of the power structure. Can you kind of like elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me tell you, there's an example of one in Canada too. It's called CareForce. And it was, it turned into a cooperative. It was, it was privately owned. It's Nova Scotia. And it's a care home. It's a cooperative of care home workers, mostly immigrant, mostly Filipina women, workers, care workers that converted the firm into cooperative, and it was very successful. Now the cooperative sold it off to, unfortunately, it lasted about 10 years. It's still present, but it sold it off to a private owner. I'm not sure. This happened last year, but this is here in Canada. Many of the first COVID-19 infections happened in care homes, and it's a system where it's highly privatized. A recent study about a month ago showed that by an advocacy group showed that in Ontario, I think it was across Canada or Ontario, the Canadians in the room might help me, most of the deaths happened in private care homes. The best care homes were the nonprofit care homes, and the best ones were the public sector care homes. Those were owned by government, right? So this converting them to cooperatives could be an immediate solution to the caring for the elderly, right? And the caring for other vulnerable communities. In Argentina, they're workers, right? There was a heavy identity at the time as being workers. The previous owners, it was a private clinic owned by a collective of doctors. It was a partnership of doctors that had abused that. Basically, this clinic went about a year. These nurses went about a year without getting paid. So it's a case study, and it's illustrative of what happened in Argentina at the time, where they weren't getting paid. The economy is crumbling. So all these things converged into this moment where the nurses took matters into their own hand, and the male maintenance workers, by the way, took matters into their own hand, but mostly the members are mostly nurses, and converted it. They knew how to run a clinic. They knew how to work with doctors. They purposely decided not to invite doctors to become the first members of the co-op because because of exactly because of that power differential. They wanted to really be in control of the space. They felt that they were closer to the community, and they decided to contract out work with sympathetic doctors, and the doctors are all sympathetic. Most of them that work there or that get contracted out are very sympathetic. This is an example of, it tackles and it crisscrosses many issues: gender, the gendered workplace, the economy of care, how the economy of care is mostly employed or is mostly populated by female workers, and racialized visible minorities as well. So it's an unusual case in Argentina because most of these conversions are in traditionally male industrial businesses, right? So, but the ones that are rooted in education and health are mostly women. Yeah. So there are cases around the world, and in Canada in particular, this case of CareForce is one example. And Italy has a strong social cooperative movement, and it also they're multi-stakeholder cooperatives, the community and staff and nurses and homes that care for the elderly and that. And it's across Italy as well, and it's also fared actually fairly well during this COVID-19 crisis in Italy, and they've been quite central there as well. So there's lots of examples.
Thank you. That's fascinating. I'm gonna pass my next question to Jen. A fascinating study and the discussion. I mean, I started with asking, who those people are, or how do you define non-worker? But you kind of answered answered my question along the way. But I kind of continue this line of discussion, seeing that most of them are retirees and that they are formal union members, maybe not the same one, but still union members. So my question kind of like, really want to ask you about how do we expand this, right? Like, when we learn that the preference and the, those things that bring those people join the union, even though they are not working, can we broaden, the base to recruit, let's say, immigrants or, people that do not have this kind of connection. So this is really kind of like a me broader thinking, how do we apply what we learned from your research?
Yeah, thanks. A really interesting question. I'm not quite sure I've got the answer to it though, unfortunately, but I think, in terms of, the membership was open to anybody who's not in employment. So it includes retirees, carers, students, people who are unemployed. But it was obvious that it was actually more difficult to relate to people, say, who are unemployed. Partly because we have a really repressive unemployment system here in the UK, where people are forced to constantly be looking for jobs in order to get their pay, to get their welfare checks. So, in a sense, if you're unemployed, you spend a lot of your time working, mostly 5 days a week, working in order just to get your welfare check. So I think there's partly that, but I also think that younger people are, the less understanding and experience they have of trade unions, whereas this group of people didn't need to be told what a trade union was, or what it does, or how they could, use it, benefit from it. So there was that sort of, demographic understanding of trade unions, which is not there for younger people within the, the general demographic. So
absolutely,
you don't know, if you teach in universities, that, students generally don't know very much about trade unions, but not even heard of trade unions. So I think there's stuff going on there, but I think, there's lots that the union movement could do, or the trade union could do, in terms of actually just tapping into those, working much more closely with student unions, for example, providing some sort of services for students that go beyond sort of just that link up that's tended to happen in the past. So I'm not sure whether that answers it, but I think, the reason it's attracting so many retired people is that they've got time on their hands, and then they've got that history of trade unionism, from their working lives.
Yeah, I think I see a nice synergy between these two people, Marcelo's book and your research project, really talking about bringing the community back into the union or back into the workplace. That part is really nice, to me, because my understanding that the U.S. trade union and some of the Canadian trade union, they still have this closed shop mentality, right? The rent formula kind of approach. And yes, that really kind of become, I would say, in my opinion, a barrier for their renewal or even their kind of expansion in some sense. So maybe we can bring this part, the community, and not even the coalition, is just open the door and bring the people, and then make the union a venue for socialization. I'm not sure, I'm still learning this part, and I'm learning on top of learning the culture and everything. But to me, it's such a cool idea.
Can I just comment on this? That
yes, absolutely.
That the notion of community unionism is not a new idea, and it's been practiced across the world. South Africa, what I'm talking about in Argentina, with these new forms of unions that work with traditional unions, the trade sector unions, but they also work in the interests of self-managed workers and co-ops, cooperative members, are forms of community unions. They have a long tradition in working class history. And I think that, mainstream unions, the big unions like Unite and like Unifor in Canada, they have to start thinking about this. Especially this is a perfect moment. This current crisis is a perfect moment to be building alliances with Black Lives Matter, with Indigenous movements, with other community interests and community social, community-based social movements. This is the right time. If there ever was a time the left has to unite in this way, right? We can't discard traditional unions because they have experience in organizing, they have experience in asking for better working conditions and all those things. But they also have to start to broaden their constituency, so to speak, right?
Tingting, can I just come in, because I'd like to just link to your research as well in terms of social media. Because one of the things that we did here in London, in a group that I'm involved, the Ella Baker School of Organising, was with a group of people to set up a coronavirus workers support group online through using social media, but particularly using through Facebook. Yep. And within a matter of days, 15,000 people had signed up to that, who were not just asking questions, but actually saying, actually, I live in such a place and I can give advice in my area. So groups were starting to form in local areas as a consequence of that. People coming forward. It's just we're thinking, like, why are the mainstream trade unions not doing this? Why isn't, an unfunded voluntary group, with, nothing at all setting this up and actually, but it having momentum and starting to build. But it could have been so much better through the finances through a mainstream union, so I'm interested in your comments on that.
Yeah. Lorenzo, you want to comment on this as well?
Just two quick comments. One, drawing on the presentation by Tingting in our paper, and another paper that I'm developing with Anthony Masi, who is here, and Bénédicte Poirier from McGill University. So the core part for me, for community unionism, social movement unionism, is really strike synergy around social network and social capital, to see how we can build a relationship, how can this relationship be used not just to mobilize people in a specific moment, but to really organize a constituency that is much broader. So theoretically, for me, we should rethink deeply the instruments that social capital, and more specifically the debate about social capital unionism, can bring into this debate, and how union can strategically also look at this in throughout time, building relationship, maintaining relationship, create a new relationship. Who are the bridges in all these relationships? On a different point, to Marcelo, about cooperatives, I'm honest, I was surfing the other session to see if everything was doing okay, and I was rocking my child. So just to tell you that I'm at the beginning of another research about cooperatives and unions, and about how oftentimes cooperatives, they share the same values of unions in terms of self-transcending, but they don't want unions at all. So this is a dimension, kind of also ethical tension between the two poles that is interesting. I'm doing here in Quebec, where we have a lot of cooperatives, especially some in the health sector, especially they are spin-off from University of Sherbrooke or other universities, and others in the tourism industry. So especially young guys, they have a bed and breakfast in some kind of countryside here in Quebec. And interestingly enough, it comes out that the core values are the same as the original core values of unions, but no unions in my home. That is it's interesting. It's just some food.
And
I mentioned,
also,
sorry, go ahead, Tingting.
Sorry, I just want to comment on, like, I'll kind of address Jane's question about why didn't a union do it. Actually, when we kind of first started this project, and we asked, like, why didn't you guys be more engaged in the fight for clean? Like, if they are talking about reach, that's the core issue of labor union. So most of the kind of like a reaction we got is that unions seem to become, especially the US unions, they become like those kind of heavy political machines. So they cared about the political implication about they post something on social media. So they said, okay, the message needs to be reviewed by our legal counsel, and we need to make sure that, our members are not kind of alienated by those messages. And we also need to make sure, because, like, we focus on SEIU, who's the kind of like a backbone of the movement, and they put a lot of like a financial investment in the 515 group as well. They said, we don't want our members to see that we spend a lot of like their dues into those movements, because they're going to consider, we want to return for the dues on ourselves. So there's a kind of like struggle within in terms of like what kind of implication or impact that their actions. So they are hesitant to do anything kind of upfront. They are hesitant to do anything innovative because this close boundary mentality between member and external participant. So it's interesting to really learn those things. We wasn't really aware or anticipate those kind of answers from labor union, which is supposed to be the democratic kind of like an institution in our society.
Yeah, just quickly address Lorenzo's comment. I agree. I did mention in my presentation really briefly at the end the ambulance sector in Quebec. That's a cooperative that's cooperativized, and in Sherbrooke and another, not in Montreal, but in other cities. And it came out of the Quebec labor movement as well. And in Quebec, there's a rich link between the labor movement and using labor funds to fund cooperatives. It's a unique Quebec model. The tension is also that unions often don't know what to do in co-ops. They feel that their role, because there's no owner, what are they going to do? Who are they going to moderate with, right? But there is a strong role in co-ops, in worker co-ops in particular for unions. That's the conditions of work. Oftentimes management level tends to emerge in co-ops. So unions can also advocate for shop floor workers, and that's often how it happens. And there's just quickly, the gig economy should become more cooperativized, and there's no reason why platform co-op solutions couldn't be used for delivery systems. And I'll give you one quick example. The Foodora workers of Toronto unionized. This was, they unionized with CUPW, which is the postal workers union, believe it or not, in Canada. They voted to unionize in December. In February, early March, the owner of Foodora, it's a German company, pulled out. They pulled out of Canada, because of, whatever financial reasons. Well, they were doing financially really great. It was because they unionized. Yeah. What are the workers? The workers are called Foodsters United. They organized into Foodsters United under CUPW, which is the postal union. What are the workers doing? They're proposing turning into a worker co-op.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Using another cooperative using a platform to do the purchasing and delivery from a cooperative that was formed in Montreal, actually. Yeah. So this is still, I think it's still in discussions, but.
That's awesome.
So one more thing. And so I spoke to the CUPW representative, and the CUPW representative, well, what would our role be?
Yeah.
Well, so then I had to explain what their role could be. They still have an important role to lobby, to represent the workers' government and policies. And anyway.
That's fascinating. Okay, I see, Anthony, you turned your camera on. I assume you have some comments. You are on mute.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to thank all of the participants for the presentations. And I also think that there are some interesting aspects to what Professor Holgate talked about in terms of the social union, the relationship between unions actually becoming organizing groups in a community and the relationship to other community groups, other aspects of civil society, because it's, as she pointed out, an untraditional role for unions to be organizing people who don't have a community of work interest, but rather show affiliation to with other groups. But I wondered if there might be some displacement of other social movements in the areas in which Unite actually operates. In other words, were there community groups that then folded because of the presence of the union? Or conversely, it's a question, not a, did they instead stimulate greater interest and participation in the community in which it was present? So I just wondered which of those might be.
Yeah, no, as far as I know, there was no displacement. They were doing work that wasn't being done. So there was lots of, supporting claimants, welfare claimants, for example, lots of stuff around, housing for people who were unemployed. But they did lots of link-ups with other groups in the area. And so they, what happened is the campaigns got stronger because they got broader as a consequence of those strong links and having financial support from the union for these very small groups that were operating communities was really beneficial. So in a sense, there was just win-win situation, in the community in terms of organising. I mean, there is a downside to it because there's sort of, there's conflict within the union as to whether this is a good thing that the union should be doing, because it costs money to pay organisers to organise in the regions, to get the members in. And there's lots of, as you know, within unions, there's lots of political infighting and just jostling for positions. And I get the sense that, even though there's been so much positive that's come out of this, that there's certain sections within the union are thinking, I'm not quite sure we want to continue this, which I think would be a huge, huge shame. But yeah, we'll see what happens.
The union in the community, they collect dues, or don't they?
No, they do, but they're very minor, so they're just 50 pence. 50 pence, which is just a tiny amount. But what has happened is, for those people who can't even afford that small amount of money, they've done link-ups with industrial branches. So industrial branches will pay the membership of those community members who can't afford it, which is a great link-up between the two.
Thank you.
Grace, just go ahead.
Hey, yeah, this was a question to Jane as well, really. Thanks, that was really interesting. So it's quite a sort of specific question about Unite. So I have a friend who's in Unite community and is also employed. And I think she joined Unite when she was unemployed. But there hasn't been any sort of like transfer process of her over to the main union. And yeah, we've had quite a lot of sort of conversations about it, because Unite community are helping her with issues at work, in the workplace at the moment. And she's sort of adamant that the advertising of the union makes it seem like everyone should be in it, whether you're employed or unemployed. So I was wondering if you think that might be sort of like a purposeful tactic that Unite community uses. And then also, do you think that they're a bit unwilling to move people out of Unite community in case they decide to move into a different union instead of Unite?
No, I mean, I think there's lots of confusion within the union about this, and I've had lots of sort of debate and discussion with senior figures in the union about it. The rules are very clear. If you're working in any form, you should be in the industrial side and paying proper union dues, the proper full union dues. In terms of moving people out, I'm a member of the Unite community. They've not thrown me out, but I think they just don't mind taking the money, really, because I don't, I'm not asking for any services or any help or anything, but it depends on the region. Some apply the union rules really strictly, and they say, okay, so now you've got a job, you have to resign your membership of Unite community. And I'm like, no, please don't do this. It's such a crazy thing to do. Why not have dual membership? Yeah. Why not say to the 1.4 million members, why don't you join Unite community and be active in your community? You can just do a quick calculation, 50 pence a week from 1.4 million members could massively increase the coffers of the union. They could then get more organisers, do more community organising, etc., etc. But again, for political reasons, it's considered that no, the proper thing to do if you're a worker is to join the industrial side. And I understand that. I understand what unions are. But nevertheless, this idea of having dual membership would be sensible. But I think there's just different interpretations in different regions, and some of those are political decisions that are being made.
Thank you. And we have to wrap up because the time is, and then thank you for all the presenters, including myself. I give myself a big pat on the back. And thank you for all the participants for your, your engagement discussion. And I want to kind of like follow Marcelo's discussion. The next session, actually one of the gig economy sessions, they're going to talk about the gig worker and the Fedora case and the Canadian postal worker unions and how they kind of like engaged in this process. So stick around, and then you're going to get more discussion that you want and interesting. Thank you. And I will see you around.
Bye, everybody. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Take care, Lorenzo.